A man sits in a London townhouse in 1832, dying at age 84, having spent 6 decades writing millions of words that almost nobody read during his lifetime. He's made arrangements for his corpse to be dissected, stuffed with hay, dressed in his own clothes and put on permanent display in a glass case. This isn't madness, it's philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. Jeremy Bentham believed every action should maximize happiness for the greatest number of people, and he calculated that his dead body could be more useful than most living ones. He was probably right, but the story of how an awkward child prodigy became the father of utilitarianism and one of history's strangest thinkers starts in a place far removed from philosophical abstractions. London in 1748 was a city of contrasts, so extreme they'd make your head spin. The wealthiest square mile on earth sat adjacent to slums where human waste ran in open gutters. Houndsditch, where Jeremy Bentham entered the world on February 15th of that year, occupied the uncomfortable middle ground. His father, Jeremiah Bentham, was an attorney who'd clawed his way up from modest origins through relentless ambition and careful cultivation of the right connections. The Benthams were Tories, supporters of traditional hierarchy and royal authority, which makes Jeremy's later radicalism all the more surprising. Actually, everything about Jeremy's childhood suggests he should have become a conventional lawyer or perhaps a dull academic. Instead, he turned into someone who questioned every assumption his society held dear. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Jeremy's mother, Alicia Woodward, had been married before. She was the widow of a Mr. Whitehorn and daughter of a mercer named Thomas Grove from Andover. The Benthams weren't aristocrats, but they had money and connections, the twin currencies of 18th century social climbing. They also had expectations. Jeremiah Bentham looked at his firstborn son and saw the family's future elevation to gentleman status. What he got was considerably more complicated. The child was strange from the beginning. At age 3, Jeremy was reading Latin, not stumbling through simple phrases, actually reading. His father came home one day to find his toddler sitting at the family desk, absorbed in a multi-volume history of England. The pages were probably bigger than the child's torso. Nobody taught him this. He simply decided books were interesting and taught himself to decode them. By age 7, Jeremy was performing Handel sonatas on the violin during dinner parties. Picture this: a small boy in formal 18th century dress, soaring away at a violin, while adults made polite conversation and tried not to stare at the tiny virtuoso in their midst. His father paraded him like a trained seal, proud but also slightly bewildered by what he'd produced. Child prodigies are rarely happy children, and Jeremy Bentham was no exception. He was physically weak, emotionally sensitive, and painfully aware that he didn't fit anywhere. His mother died when he was around 11, leaving a wound that never quite healed. He had one sibling who survived infancy, a younger brother named Samuel, and the two boys became intensely close. Samuel would later become a naval architect and diplomat, but in childhood, he was Jeremy's only real companion in a household that felt increasingly cold and demanding. Jeremy spent significant time at his grandmother's country houses, escaping the pressure cooker atmosphere of his father's ambitions. These visits were among the few genuinely happy memories of his childhood. Open fields, books, time to think without someone constantly measuring his performance against impossible standards. Then came Westminster School. In 1755, at age 7, Jeremy was sent to one of England's most prestigious educational institutions. He would later call it a wretched place for instruction. That's putting it mildly. Westminster operated on the principle that beating knowledge into children was the most efficient method of education. The curriculum consisted of endless Latin and Greek, memorization without understanding, and physical punishment for any failure to perform. Jeremy was small, weak, and intellectually miles ahead of his classmates, in some ways while completely unprepared for the brutality of public school life in others. He was bullied mercilessly. The older boys tormented him. The masters hit him for infractions real and imagined. He learned to hate institutional education with a passion that would later fuel his radical proposals for reform. But here's what's interesting. Westminster didn't break him. It made him angry, and that anger would power decades of work challenging every form of institutional cruelty he encountered. The seeds of Bentham's utilitarianism, his insistence that pleasure and pain are the only real measures of value, were planted in a schoolyard where pain was the primary teaching tool. 5 years of Westminster, 5 years of misery. Then in 1760, at age 12, his father sent him to Queen's College, Oxford. Surely university would be better. Surely it wasn't. Oxford in the mid-18th century was, in Bentham's later assessment, a seat of privilege, prejudice and idleness. The colleges existed primarily to provide comfortable livings for the sons of gentlemen and the occasional brilliant scholarship boy who knew his place. Actual education was almost an afterthought. Jeremy completed his bachelor's degree in 1764 at age 16. He received his master's degree 3 years later. The whole experience taught him exactly one useful thing. Institutional learning was broken, perhaps irreparably. The dons were lazy. The students were lazy. The curriculum was obsolete. Nobody seemed to care because the system served its real purpose, which wasn't education, but social reproduction. The one bright spot came in 1763, when Bentham attended lectures by William Blackstone, the newly appointed Vinerian Professor of English law. Blackstone was publishing his commentaries on the laws of England, which would become the foundational text of English legal education for the next century. Everyone treated Blackstone like a genius. Bentham sat in those lectures and thought, this is nonsense. Blackstone argued that English common law represented the perfection of natural law principles, that the British Constitution was a miracle of balanced government, that everything was basically fine as it should be. Bentham detected glaring fallacies in every lecture. The reasoning was circular, the conclusions were predetermined. Blackstone wasn't analysing the law, he was providing sophisticated justifications for whatever existed. This realisation was crucial. Bentham would spend the next 60 years of his life fighting against what he called the everything as it should be school of thought. Blackstone became his great intellectual enemy, the symbol of complacent acceptance of irrational tradition. But at age 16, Bentham wasn't ready to challenge anyone. He was just a weird, unhappy teenager who'd been force-fed classical education and found it wanting. His father wanted him to become a lawyer. Jeremy dutifully pursued that path, training for the bar while privately harbouring serious doubts about the entire legal profession. He was called to the bar in 1769, at age 21. His legal career lasted approximately 0 cases. He never practiced law, not once. Instead, something else happened that year, something that would redirect his entire life. Bentham discovered the principle of utility. Actually, that's not quite accurate. The principle had been floating around for a while. Joseph Priestley had written about the greatest happiness for the greatest number in a political tract published in 1768. David Hume had explored similar ideas in his philosophical works. French philosophers like Helvetius were developing their own versions. The Italian criminologist Cesare Beccaria had applied utilitarian thinking to penal reform in his treatise on crimes and punishments. But when Bentham encountered these ideas in 1768 and 1769, they hit him like a revelation. Suddenly, everything made sense. You could judge laws, institutions, and actions by a single clear standard. Did they increase happiness or decrease it? Did they create more pleasure than pain? Everything else, all the appeals to tradition and natural law and divine right, was just sophisticated mystification designed to protect existing power structures. It sounds simple, almost obvious. That's what made it radical. If you take the utility principle seriously, Most of what 18th century English society considered sacred becomes indefensible. Aristocratic privilege can't be justified on utilitarian grounds. Legal systems that punish minor crimes with death, obviously counterproductive. Religious persecution, pure waste of human happiness. The entire edifice of traditional authority rested on foundations that crumbled the moment you asked whether they actually made people happier. Bentham saw all of this immediately, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of practicing law, he would reform it. Instead of accepting society as it was, he would design how it should be. He would create what he called a panomion, a complete utilitarian code of law that would replace the accumulated nonsense of centuries with rational, happiness-maximizing rules. This was an insane ambition. One man, working alone, was going to redesign civilization from first principles. But Bentham had certain advantages. His father's death in 1792 would eventually leave him financially independent through inheritance. He had no family responsibilities, never married, never had children. He could devote every waking hour to his project without the complications that derail most people's grand ambitions. And he did. For the next 6 decades, Bentham wrote, 8 to 12 hours a day, every day, filling page after page with his distinctive handwriting. The output was staggering, probably exceeding 6 million words over his lifetime. He wrote about law, about punishment, about economics, about politics, about education, about religion, about sex, about animal rights, about international relations, about everything he could think of that might benefit from utilitarian analysis. Most of it was never published during his lifetime. Bentham was a compulsive reviser who could rarely bring himself to declare anything finished. He'd write hundreds of pages, then start over because he'd thought of a better way to structure the argument. He'd draft elaborate treatises, then abandon them to pursue some new tangent that seemed more urgent. His friends found this maddening. His disciples learned to extract publishable material from the mountains of manuscript and edit it into coherent form, essentially doing the work Bentham couldn't bring himself to complete. The writing consumed him so completely that he suffered periodic bouts of what he called psychosomatic blindness. His eyes would simply stop working from the strain and stress. Only the devoted care of friends brought him through these episodes, which were apparently terrifying experiences of total darkness and depression that left him convinced he'd never see again. But here's what's remarkable. Despite the personal cost, despite the obsessive revision, despite the fact that most of his work remained unpublished, Bentham's ideas began to spread. His first major publication came in 1776, the same year as American Independence and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It was called a fragment on government, and it was published anonymously. The fragment was a surgical demolition of a few pages from Blackstone's commentaries. Bentham took Blackstone's discussion of the origin of society and exposed every logical fallacy, every circular argument, every unexamined assumption. The book was brilliant, so brilliant that readers assumed it must have been written by some established legal mind. Names were suggested. Surely it was this famous lawyer or that distinguished philosopher. Then Bentham's proud father accidentally revealed that his son had written it. Immediately, interest evaporated. The public had been fascinated by the mysterious, brilliant author. They were decidedly less interested in some unknown 28-year-old who'd never practiced law. The same book that had seemed profound when attributed to an authority suddenly looked like the work of an overconfident young man when the real author was known. Bentham learned a valuable lesson about reputation and credibility. Your ideas only matter if people think you matter. It's a frustrating reality for anyone who believes that arguments should be judged on their merits, rather than their source, but it's a reality nonetheless. The fragment should have launched Bentham's career. Instead, it became a footnote to his early period, overshadowed by what would come next. Because Bentham was just getting started, he had identified the fundamental principle that would guide all his work. Now he needed to apply it systematically to every area of human life that needed reform, which in his view was basically everything. The legal system, the penal system, the economic system, the political system, education, religion, social customs, all of it needed to be examined through the cold, clear lens of utility and rebuilt according to rational principles that actually served human happiness. What he didn't fully realize yet was how this project would consume his entire life, or how much resistance he would face from a society that had no interest in being rationally reorganized by some eccentric philosopher. The breakthrough came in 1781, though Bentham didn't recognize it as such at the time. He was invited to Bowwood, the country estate of William Petty, the Earl of Shelburne, a prominent Whig politician with genuine power and influence. This was exactly the kind of access Bentham needed, not just to spread his ideas, but to see them implemented. Shelburne's circle included lawyers, politicians, economists, people who could actually change things. And Bentham, despite his social awkwardness and tendency to lecture rather than converse, impressed them. His arguments were too precise to dismiss, his vision too comprehensive to ignore. It was at Bowwood that Bentham had what he described as a dream. He was founding a sect, he imagined, a movement of people dedicated to a single principle. They would be called the Utilitarians. The name stuck. Whether it actually came to him in a dream, or whether he invented the dream story later to make the coining sound more mystical, we don't know. But from that point forward, Bentham had both a philosophy and a brand. Through Shelburne, he met Etienne Dumont, a Genevan exile who would become crucial to Bentham's reputation in ways neither of them anticipated. Dumont saw immediately what Bentham's other friends had learned through long experience. The man could think brilliantly, but couldn't write publishably. His manuscripts were vast, wandering, repetitive, structured according to some internal logic that made perfect sense to Bentham and no sense to anyone else. Dumont started editing. More than editing, actually. He took Bentham's sprawling drafts, extracted the arguments, reorganized them into coherent form, translated them into French, and published them in continental Europe. The books became influential almost immediately. Bentham's ideas spread across Europe and beyond, carried by Dumont's readable prose rather than Bentham's original impenetrable manuscripts. The irony wasn't lost on Bentham's friends. Here was a man who spent 12 hours a day writing, producing millions of words over his lifetime, becoming famous primarily through someone else's edited versions of his work. But Bentham didn't seem to mind. What mattered was the ideas, not the credit for their exact phrasing. Then in 1786, something happened that would obsess Bentham for the next 16 years and permanently embitter him against the British establishment. His brother Samuel was in Russia, working for Prince Potemkin on various industrial projects. Bentham decided to visit. Russia was strange and fascinating. Bentham wrote a defense of usury there, his first major contribution to economic theory. He argued against Adam Smith's support for legal limits on interest rates, pointing out that such restrictions contradicted Smith's own principles of free trade and would stifle innovation. The argument was characteristically Bentham. Find the internal contradiction in the opponent's position, expose it with surgical precision, propose a rational alternative. But the real discovery came from Samuel. His brother had designed a circular building for managing workers in Potemkin's factories. The principle was simple: a central inspection tower surrounded by individual workstations. From the tower, a supervisor could observe every worker, but the workers couldn't tell when they were being watched. The result was self-regulation through the possibility of constant surveillance. Jeremy saw immediately that this principle could revolutionize prison management. He expanded Samuel's industrial concept into a complete theory of institutional control. The Panopticon, he called it, Greek for all-seeing. A prison designed as a circular building with cells around the perimeter and an inspection tower at the centre. The inspector could see into every cell, but prisoners could never see the inspector. They would never know if they were being watched at any given moment, so they would have to assume they were always being watched. The genius, Bentham believed, was that it achieved control through architecture rather than violence. Prisoners would regulate their own behaviour because they couldn't know when observation was occurring. It was, as he put it, a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind, in a quantity hitherto without example. He became consumed by the idea. This wasn't just a prison design, it was a demonstration of how rational principles could solve practical problems. It was proof that utilitarianism worked. Back in England, Bentham commissioned architectural drawings. He wrote elaborate descriptions of every aspect of the building: the cells, the inspection tower, the ventilation, the heating, even a system of speaking tubes that would allow the inspector to communicate with prisoners without being seen. In 1791, he published Panopticon, or The Inspection House, laying out the full scheme. But he didn't just want to publish the idea, he wanted to build it. More than that, he wanted to run it himself as contractor governor. He would demonstrate that his system could reform criminals more effectively and humanely than traditional prisons, while also being more economical. He tried Ireland first, no interest. Revolutionary France? They had other concerns. So he turned to Britain, attempting to persuade Prime Minister William Pitt to revive an earlier abandoned plan for a national penitentiary, this time built as a panopticon with Bentham as its manager. And incredibly, he succeeded. Sort of. In 1794, the government paid him £2,000 for preliminary work. It seemed like his vision would finally become reality. He spent years refining the plans, negotiating over sites, working through administrative details. Then the delays started. The site he'd chosen had legal complications. The landowners objected. The government needed more studies. Each obstacle led to another negotiation, another compromise, another delay. Bentham kept working, kept revising, kept believing the project would move forward. 16 years. That's how long he spent trying to make the Panopticon happen. 16 years of his life devoted to what he thought would be his greatest practical achievement. And in the end, the government abandoned the project entirely. No prison would be built. No demonstration of utilitarian principles in action. Just wasted years and mounting bitterness. The experience changed Bentham fundamentally. He became convinced that the failure wasn't about practical obstacles or legitimate concerns. It was about what he called sinister interest, the vested interests of the powerful conspiring against reform. The king opposed it. The aristocracy opposed it, not because the design was flawed, but because it threatened their control. This realization radicalized him. The early Bentham had been reformist, but not revolutionary. He believed existing institutions could be improved through rational argument and careful design. The post-Panopticon Bentham became convinced that the entire system was rigged against change. The people in power had no interest in reforms that might reduce their power. His political writings became more aggressive. Where he'd once focused on legal and penal reform, he now tackled political structures themselves. Who should vote? How should representatives be chosen? What limits should exist on government power? In 1789, he'd written what he called a projet of a constitutional code for France, produced quickly in response to the French Revolution. The proposals were radical, even by revolutionary standards. Universal adult suffrage, including women, subject only to a literacy test. Equal political rights, regardless of sex or property. These ideas didn't appear in his published work at the time. They were too extreme, too likely to discredit him, but they show where his thinking was heading. The principle of utility, applied consistently, led to positions that 18th century society wasn't ready to accept. As a result of his writings on France, Bentham was made an honorary French citizen in 1792. He was flattered but also alarmed by the violence that followed the Jacobins' rise to power. He'd advocated rational reform. They were producing revolutionary terror. The gap between utilitarian theory and revolutionary practice disturbed him deeply. He remained an outspoken critic of the concept of natural rights, which he considered philosophical nonsense. Rights didn't exist in nature. They were created by law and should be judged by whether they increased or decreased overall happiness. The French revolutionaries' declaration of natural rights struck him as dangerous mysticism, replacing religious dogma with political dogma equally unfounded in reason. His own life during this period was relatively stable, at least financially. His father died in 1792, leaving him a considerable inheritance from real estate speculation. From that point on, Bentham had the financial independence to pursue his work without needing to practice law or seek patronage. He could write 12 hours a day without worrying about income. But financial stability didn't bring personal happiness. He never married. His relationships with women remain largely mysterious, though there's evidence of at least one significant romantic attachment that didn't work out. He lived alone, or with servants, or occasionally with his brother Samuel when Samuel was in England. His social life centred on a circle of disciples and friends who shared his commitment to reform. He hosted gatherings, engaged in extensive correspondence, and gradually built a network of people dedicated to utilitarian principles. These weren't just philosophical discussions, they were planning sessions for actual reform efforts. The network included Samuel Romilly, a lawyer working for criminal law reform, Henry Brougham, who would later become Lord Chancellor, George Grote, who would advocate for the secret ballot, David Ricardo, the economist, Francis Place, a radical artisan who organised working-class political activity, and increasingly, it included James Mill, a Scottish philosopher and historian who met Bentham around 1808. Mill became Bentham's most important disciple, the person who could translate Bentham's ideas into politically actionable form. They spent summers together at Ford Abbey, Bentham's country house in Somerset, working through problems and planning campaigns. Mill brought his young son, John Stuart, to these gatherings. The boy absorbed utilitarian principles almost from birth. His education, directed by his father, according to Bentham's theories, would produce one of the 19th century's most influential philosophers. But that was still years away. What mattered in the first decade of the 1800s was that Bentham was building something larger than himself, a movement, a school of thought with multiple advocates working on different fronts: legal reform, political reform, economic reform, educational reform, all guided by the same fundamental principle: the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In 1823, Bentham and James Mill co-founded the Westminster Review, a journal explicitly dedicated to advancing utilitarian ideas and the cause of political radicalism. It gave the philosophical radicals, as they were called, a platform to challenge both Tory and Whig orthodoxies. The philosophical radicals weren't a formal political party. They were a loose network of intellectuals and activists who agreed that Britain's problems stemmed from an antiquated legal system and the control of the economy by a hereditary landed gentry opposed to modern capitalist development. They wanted reform, not revolution, systematic change guided by rational principles, not violent upheaval. Bentham's influence on British public life was growing, even as his frustration with the pace of change intensified. He'd lived long enough to see some of his ideas gain traction. Criminal law was being reformed, partly along lines he'd advocated. The movement for parliamentary reform was building momentum, drawing on arguments he'd made, but he'd also lived long enough to see how resistant institutions were to fundamental change, how the powerful protected their interests, how reform efforts got watered down or blocked entirely. The Panopticon failure had taught him that lesson permanently. He was 75 years old in 1823. Most men his age were retired, content with their legacy, ready to fade quietly. Bentham was accelerating. The Westminster Review wasn't just another journal, it was a weapon, a deliberate attempt to create institutional power for ideas that couldn't gain traction through normal channels. The Tories controlled most of the press. The Whigs had their own publications, but neither party wanted genuine reform. They wanted stability, tradition, the continuation of arrangements that served their interests. The philosophical radicals needed their own voice. The first issue attacked everything the establishment held sacred: aristocratic privilege, the corruption of Parliament, the absurdities of the legal system, the alliance between church and state. It was aggressive, intellectual, and utterly uncompromising. Readers were either thrilled or outraged. There was no middle ground. What made the journal dangerous wasn't just its politics, it was its method. The radicals didn't argue from tradition or authority. They argued from utility. They asked one simple question about every institution, every law, every custom. Does this increase happiness or decrease it? If it decreases happiness, it should be changed. Period. No appeal to history or divine sanction could justify suffering. This approach demolished arguments that had stood for centuries. Take the monarchy. Defenders claimed kings were necessary for stability, ordained by God, essential to British identity. The radicals responded, what does the monarchy actually do? It costs enormous sums. It perpetuates hereditary privilege. It concentrates power without accountability. Does any of this increase the greatest happiness? No? Then abolish it. They applied the same logic to everything. The House of Lords, the established church, property qualifications for voting, laws against trade unions. Each institution was stripped of its mystique and examined coldly. Most failed the test. The establishment's response was predictable. They called the radicals dangerous, atheistic French. That last insult carried particular weight. The French Revolution's violence was still fresh in memory. Anyone advocating radical change was suspected of wanting guillotines in London. The radicals had to constantly distance themselves from revolutionary excesses while maintaining their commitment to fundamental reform. It was a delicate balance. Bentham himself was growing more radical with age. His early work had been cautious, working within existing frameworks. By the 1820s, he'd abandoned caution. He wanted universal suffrage, not just for property-owning men, but for all men and women. He argued this in private correspondence, though he knew publishing it would destroy his credibility. Even among reformers, women's suffrage was too extreme. His position on sexuality was similarly ahead of its time. Around 1785, he'd written an essay defending homosexuality, arguing that laws against it caused far more harm than the practice itself. Sexual acts between consenting adults harmed no one. Prosecuting them destroyed lives, created blackmail opportunities, and reflected religious prejudice rather than rational analysis. But he never published it. He wasn't that brave, or maybe he was that strategic. Publishing would have ended his influence overnight. The essay sat in his papers, unknown except to a few close associates. It wouldn't see print until 1931, almost a century after his death. Even then, it caused scandal. The full text didn't appear until 1978. Bentham was genuinely ahead of his era on this issue, but he chose silence over martyrdom. You can judge that choice either way. On other issues, he was willing to fight publicly. He attacked slavery with the same utilitarian logic he applied to everything else. Slavery caused immense suffering to the enslaved. It degraded both slave and master. It retarded economic development by removing incentives for innovation. It corrupted legal systems that had to maintain it through violence. By every measure, it failed the utility test. Abolish it. His arguments influenced the abolitionist movement, though he wasn't its primary leader. William Wilberforce and others drove that campaign. But Bentham provided intellectual ammunition. His systematic demolition of slavery's justifications made it harder for defenders to claim reason was on their side. He applied similar reasoning to capital punishment. Hanging someone didn't deter crime more effectively than lesser punishments. It prevented any possibility of correcting errors. It brutalized society by making violence official, and it was irreversible. Once you executed an innocent person, you couldn't fix the mistake. The utility calculation was clear. Capital punishment caused more harm than benefit. End it. On corporal punishment, he was equally clear. Beating children didn't make them better learners. It made them afraid and resentful. It taught them that violence was how problems were solved. It damaged the relationship between parent and child, or teacher and student. Better methods existed. Use them. This wasn't soft-hearted sentimentalism. It was calculation. Bentham genuinely believed that measuring happiness and suffering could guide every decision. If you could quantify pleasure and pain, you could determine the right action mathematically. The philosophic calculus, he called it. 7 variables to measure the value of any pleasure or pain. Intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. Plug in the numbers, and you'd know what to do. Critics found this absurd. You can't measure happiness mathematically. Different people value different things. What makes one person happy might make another miserable. How do you compare the pleasure of eating cake with the pleasure of reading poetry? Bentham had answers, but they never quite convinced skeptics. The deeper problem was this: even if you could measure happiness perfectly, should happiness be the only thing that matters? What about rights, justice, dignity, beauty? Bentham dismissed these as fictions. Natural rights, he famously said, were nonsense upon stilts. There were no rights except those created by law, and law should be based solely on utility. This position horrified many reformers who were fighting for human rights. They wanted to say slavery was wrong because it violated human dignity, not just because it reduced net happiness. They wanted to say torture was wrong inherently, not just instrumentally. Bentham refused. If torturing one person could save 100 lives, utility demanded torture. The math was clear. He didn't advocate torture, of course. He thought it almost never actually increased happiness, but he couldn't say it was absolutely wrong. Nothing was absolutely wrong, except failing to maximize utility. This made him a difficult ally for rights-based reformers. His influence nevertheless grew. By the late 1820s, Benthamism was a recognized force in British politics. The philosophical radicals weren't numerous, but they were organized and intellectually formidable. They'd infiltrated institutions, built networks, trained a generation of younger reformers. When the question of parliamentary reform reached crisis point in the early 1830s, they were positioned to shape the outcome. The crisis had been building for decades. Britain's parliament represented geography from centuries earlier. Rotten boroughs with almost no population sent members to parliament. Growing industrial cities had no representation at all. The system was corrupt, with seats openly bought and sold. Everyone knew it was absurd, but the beneficiaries resisted change. The philosophical radicals wanted universal suffrage, annual parliaments, secret ballots. They got none of that in the Reform Bill of 1832. What they got was modest expansion of the electorate and elimination of the worst rotten boroughs. It was something, but nowhere near enough. Bentham, who died that June, saw the bill pass but knew it fell short. His disciple, Lord Brougham, now Lord Chancellor, had helped push the reform through. George Grote, another Benthamite, had entered Parliament and would advocate for the secret ballot for years. The movement Bentham built was achieving modest victories. Whether that satisfied him is unclear. What's clear is that he never stopped working. Even in his 80s, he wrote for hours each day. The papers piled up, manuscripts on law, on logic, on political economy, on constitutional design. Some were published during his lifetime. Most weren't. He couldn't stop revising, couldn't bring projects to completion. The perfect code of laws remained forever, just beyond reach. His daily routine was rigid. He rose early, ate a simple breakfast, and went to his study. He'd write until exhausted, sometimes 12 hours straight. He barely left his house. Visitors came to him. He'd emerge for meals or to receive guests, then retreat back to work. His health was failing, but his mind remained sharp. The body was giving out while the intellect raged on. He was difficult to live with, demanding, obsessive, convinced of his own rightness. But he was also generous to his followers, supporting them financially and promoting their work. The Mills lived in a house he owned. He funded publications, supported scholars, gave freely to causes he believed in. His wealth, inherited from his father, went towards spreading utilitarian ideas. The question of how much he actually enjoyed life is hard to answer. He'd spent decades analysing happiness, calculating it, making it the foundation of his entire philosophy. But was he happy? His writings suggest not particularly. He had friends, work he valued, the satisfaction of intellectual achievement. But he also had loneliness, frustration, the constant awareness that the world wasn't changing fast enough. There's something almost tragic about it. The philosopher of happiness, unable to quite achieve it himself. The advocate of pleasure, living an austere, work-obsessed existence. The champion of human flourishing, isolated in his study, writing manuscripts that might never be read. But maybe that's reading too much into it. Maybe Bentham was happy precisely because he was doing what he valued most, thinking, writing, trying to improve the world through systematic analysis. His relationship with religion had evolved. Raised Anglican, he'd lost faith early. By adulthood, he was functionally atheist, though he avoided the label publicly. He viewed religion as a source of suffering. It created guilt, fear, division. It justified cruelty through appeals to divine will. It retarded progress by sanctifying tradition. The Church's alliance with the state gave it power to enforce conformity. He wanted that alliance broken, but he was careful. Open atheism would have destroyed his influence. He criticised religion's effects while avoiding direct attacks on belief itself. He argued for disestablishment, for removing the Church's official status, while claiming to respect sincere faith. It was strategic ambiguity, and it mostly worked. By 1830, Bentham knew he was approaching the end. He was 82, his health deteriorating steadily. He began making arrangements. The most important concerned his body. He'd been thinking about this for decades, since he was 21. Now he formalised the plan. After death, his body would be dissected for medical education, then preserved and displayed as an auto-icon. The logic was pure Bentham. Dead bodies had utility. They could advance medical knowledge through dissection. They could serve as memorials more authentic than statues or paintings. They could reduce the horror of death by making it familiar. And they could benefit public health by not rotting in graveyards. Why waste a perfectly good corpse on burial? He wrote detailed instructions. His friend Thomas Southwood Smith would perform the dissection. The skeleton would be preserved, dressed in Bentham's clothes, and displayed publicly. Even death would serve utility, even his corpse would teach. He died on June 6, 1832, 84 years old, still working almost to the end. The last month of his life, he was too weak to write, but he dictated when he could. The mind refused to stop, even as the body finally gave out. 2 days later, invitations went out to a select group. Friends, followers, people who'd known him or studied with him. They were invited to witness something England had never seen before. On June 9th, at 3 in the afternoon, they gathered at the Webb Street School of Anatomy and Medicine in Suffolk. Thomas Southwood Smith, the physician who'd received Bentham's final instructions, stood before them. On the table lay Bentham's body, partially covered by a sheet. Southwood Smith delivered an oration. It was long, detailed, explaining Bentham's philosophy, his contributions, his vision for how death could serve the living. He spoke about utility extending beyond life, about the rational use of cadavers for medical education, about breaking down the superstitious horror surrounding death. The audience listened. Some were moved, others were disturbed. The whole scene was unsettling. This formal speech over a dead philosopher's body, treating it as an educational demonstration rather than a funeral. Then came the dissection. Southwood Smith performed it methodically, explaining each step. Bentham had wanted this. Medical knowledge advanced through anatomical study, but bodies were scarce. The law restricted dissection to executed criminals, and there weren't enough of those to supply medical schools. Students learned on stolen corpses, bodies dug up from graveyards by resurrection men. Bentham's solution was voluntary donation. Let people will their bodies to science, make it respectable, even admirable. He'd demonstrate by example. The dissection completed, the next phase began. The skeleton was cleaned, reconstructed, and dressed in Bentham's own clothes. Black suit, white shirt, walking stick in hand. The head was preserved through mummification, though the process didn't work well. The features distorted, the skin darkened and shriveled. It looked grotesque. A wax head was commissioned instead. The sculptor worked from death masks and portraits, creating something that looked more like Bentham had in life. This was attached to the skeleton. The mummified head was placed at the feet. The whole assembly was installed in a wooden cabinet with a glass front. The auto icon was complete. Bentham sitting upright, dressed as if alive, his actual skeleton supporting the clothes, his wax face staring out through the glass. It was bizarre, macabre, perfectly Benthamite. The auto icon was displayed in his home initially, then moved to University College London, the institution his ideas had helped inspire. It sits there still in the entrance to the student centre, where thousands of students pass it daily. Some find it creepy, others find it fascinating, most just find it weird. But that's the point, isn't it? Bentham challenged conventional thinking about everything, including death. Why should corpses rot uselessly in the ground when they could serve educational purposes? Why treat dead bodies with reverence when they're just matter, no longer housing consciousness? The utilitarian logic is impeccable. The execution is deeply strange. University College London itself represents another piece of Bentham's legacy, though his actual role in its founding is often exaggerated. He's called the spiritual founder, which is accurate. His ideas about education shaped its creation. England's universities in the early 19th century were exclusive. Oxford and Cambridge required students to be Anglican. They served the elite, trained clergy and gentlemen, and resisted modernisation. Bentham had hated them since his own student days. His followers wanted something different. A university open to everyone, regardless of religion, class or gender. A place focused on practical knowledge and modern subjects, not just classics and theology. A secular institution in a religious age. University College London opened in 1826. Bentham was 78, still alive but not directly involved in the day-to-day establishment. His friend and disciple James Mill was central to the planning. So were Henry Brougham, George Grote, and others from Bentham's circle. They called it the University of London initially. The name was presumptuous since it wasn't chartered to grant degrees yet, but the ambition was clear. This would be London's answer to Oxford and Cambridge, built on radically different principles. No religious tests for admission, no restrictions based on wealth or background. Women could attend lectures alongside men, unheard of at the time. The curriculum included modern languages, science, medicine, law, practical subjects for a commercial age. The established universities and the Church of England were horrified. They called it the godless institution of Gower Street. Critics predicted moral collapse, intellectual chaos, the breakdown of proper social order. But it worked. Students came. The model proved viable. Other institutions followed, adopting similar principles. British higher education began its slow transformation from aristocratic finishing school to something more democratic and useful. Bentham's influence was philosophical, not administrative. He never sat on the founding committee, never taught there, never even visited, as far as we know. But his ideas permeated the institution's structure and mission. The autoicon's presence at UCL became symbolic. Here was the radical philosopher, still among the students, still challenging orthodoxy even in death. The display was controversial from the start. Some thought it honoured Bentham's wishes and demonstrated his commitment to utility. Others found it disrespectful, a grotesque spectacle. Stories accumulated, students claimed the autoicon attended council meetings, wheeled in to be counted present, but not voting. This is probably legend, though it captures something true about how Bentham's presence, physical and intellectual, lingered over the institution. The wax head deteriorated over time. It was replaced in the 1960s. The mummified head, originally at the feet, was stolen by students as pranks multiple times before finally being locked away in the college vaults. Now only the skeleton with its wax head sits in the cabinet, dressed in Bentham's clothes, staring through glass at passing students. What would he think of his afterlife? Probably he'd be pleased. The body served its purpose through dissection. The display makes people think about death, utility, the use of human remains. It's educational, provocative, memorable, pure utility. But there's something sad about it too. The man who spent his life thinking about happiness, who built an entire moral system around maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, reduced to a dressed skeleton in a box. The philosopher who wanted to improve the world, still sitting in one place, unable to speak or write or influence events. The ideas travelled farther than the body. That's what matters. Bentham's writings, edited and published by his followers, spread across Europe and beyond. Etienne Dumont's French translations made him famous on the continent. English editions brought his work to wider audiences. The philosophical radicals, as they came to be called, pushed his agenda in British politics. The Westminster Review, founded in 1823 by Bentham and James Mill, became their journal. Through it, they argued for reform, attacked privilege, advocated for utilitarian principles in law and government. Their influence grew through the 1820s and 1830s. The Reform Act of 1832, passed just months after Bentham's death, wasn't purely their achievement, but they'd pushed for it. The expansion of voting rights, the reduction of aristocratic control over Parliament, the beginning of Britain's transformation toward democracy, all this aligned with Benthamite goals. Henry Brougham, Bentham's friend, became Lord Chancellor and pushed legal reforms. George Grote entered Parliament and advocated for the secret ballot. John Stuart Mill, James's son, would become the most famous philosopher of the next generation, developing utilitarianism far beyond where Bentham left it. The network of influence spread. Edwin Chadwick applied utilitarian principles to public health, helping create modern sanitation systems. John Bowring, Bentham's literary executor, became a diplomat and spread utilitarian ideas internationally. Francis Place, the radical tailor, organised working-class political movements inspired by Benthamite thought. But influence also means distortion. Bentham's ideas were simplified, modified, sometimes used to justify things he wouldn't have supported. Utilitarianism became associated with cold calculation, with reducing human life to arithmetic, with justifying cruelty in the name of the greatest good. Critics attacked it from all sides. Conservatives saw it as dangerous radicalism, destroying tradition and moral certainty. Romantics found it soulless, reducing beauty and love to mere pleasure calculations. Religious thinkers condemned its secular foundation, its rejection of divine law. Thomas Carlyle called it pig philosophy, implying it reduced humans to animals seeking pleasure. Charles Dickens satirized utilitarian education in hard times, portraying it as crushing imagination and humanity. Even sympathetic critics found problems in the system's foundations. How do you measure happiness? Bentham tried to quantify it, creating his felicific calculus with its intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity. But can you really reduce human experience to numbers? Can you compare one person's joy with another's suffering on a common scale? The interpersonal comparison problem haunted utilitarianism from the start. Bentham assumed we could aggregate happiness across individuals. But how? What if your pleasure comes from my pain? What if we value different things, experience satisfaction differently? He never solved these problems. Neither has anyone since. Utilitarianism remains influential precisely because it asks the right questions, not because it provides definitive answers. Modern ethics still grapples with Bentham's legacy. Act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, all are descendants of his original formulation. Philosophers debate whether to maximize average happiness or total happiness, whether to count future generations, whether animal suffering matters equally to humans. Bentham would recognize these debates. He started them. His insistence that morality should be grounded in observable consequences rather than abstract principles, that we should care about suffering wherever it occurs, that traditional moral rules need justification through their effects, all this remains vital to contemporary ethical thought. Practical applications of utilitarian thinking shape modern policy, cost-benefit analysis in government, quality-adjusted life years in healthcare, effective altruism in charity, all draw on Benthamite logic. Calculate consequences, maximize good outcomes, minimize harm. The framework persists even when the details get complicated. But something was lost in the translation from Bentham's comprehensive system to modern applications. He didn't just propose a moral principle, he tried to build a complete science of legislation, a systematic approach to law reform, a method for analysing and improving every aspect of social organisation. That ambition failed. The Panopticon, his complete code of law, was never completed. The thousands of pages of manuscript, the decades of work, produced fragments and insights rather than the unified system he envisioned. Maybe the task was impossible. Maybe human society is too complex, too variable, too resistant to systematic codification. Maybe Bentham's faith in reason and calculation was naive, or maybe he just ran out of time. 84 years wasn't enough to complete the project he'd set himself. No single lifetime would be. What he left behind was scattered, incomplete, often contradictory. The published works during his lifetime were few. Most of his writing remained in manuscript, edited and published by others after his death. The editorial process shaped his legacy, sometimes clarifying, sometimes distorting his original intentions. John Bowring published 11 volumes of Bentham's works between 1838 and 1843, drawing from the mountain of manuscripts. But Bowring wasn't always careful. He combined different texts, omitted material he found offensive or irrelevant, imposed his own organisation on Bentham's scattered writings. The result was influential but incomplete. Scholars today recognise that we don't have definitive versions of many Benthamite texts. The Collected Works project, begun in the 1960s and still continuing, has been slowly producing more accurate editions, restoring material Bowring omitted, providing proper scholarly apparatus. This ongoing editorial work keeps revealing new dimensions of Bentham's thought. The unpublished writings on sexual nonconformity, finally published in the late 20th century, showed him arguing for decriminalizing homosexuality in the 1780s. The essays on religion, more radical than his published work suggested, revealed deeper skepticism about Christianity. The manuscripts on political economy challenged laissez-faire orthodoxy in ways that surprised later readers. Bentham wasn't a pure free market advocate. He supported government intervention when utility demanded it, criticised monopolies, defended poor relief. These positions sat uncomfortably with the image of him as an early libertarian, but they followed logically from his principles. Maximize happiness. Sometimes markets do that, sometimes they don't. His thoughts on colonialism evolved across decades. Early writings accepted empire as potentially beneficial if properly administered. Later work grew more critical, questioning whether colonial rule could ever serve the interests of the colonized. He never fully resolved the tension between utilitarian universalism, everyone's happiness counts equally, and the reality of imperial domination. Another blind spot in an otherwise systematic philosophy. The religious writings were explosive. Bentham despised organized religion, viewing it as a source of unnecessary suffering, irrational fear, and obstacles to reform. Analysis of the influence of natural religion and Church of Englandism and its catechism tore into Christian doctrine with withering sarcasm. God was either indifferent or malevolent, given the amount of suffering in the world. Religious morality was arbitrary, inconsistent, harmful. These texts couldn't be published during his lifetime. The backlash would have been catastrophic. Even his close associates found this material disturbing. James Mill, himself no friend to religion, worried about the political consequences of open atheism. John Stuart Mill later tried to soften his mentor's anti-religious stance, suggesting Bentham had been too harsh, too dismissive of religion's social functions. But the old man had meant every word. Organised religion was, in his view, an enemy of human happiness. What's striking is the consistency. From youth to old age, Bentham believed reason could solve social problems if people would just apply it properly. Calculate consequences, maximize utility, reform institutions accordingly. He never wavered in this conviction, despite decades of frustration and failure. The Panopticon debacle didn't shake his faith. The slow pace of legal reform didn't discourage him. He kept writing, kept proposing, kept believing that eventually someone would listen. Someone did listen. The Westminster Review, founded in 1823 with James Mill, became the voice of Bentham's ideas. The philosophical radicals, his followers, pushed for reform in Parliament. Henry Brougham championed legal changes. George Grote advocated for secret ballot voting. Edwin Chadwick applied utilitarian principles to public health. The influence was real, if slower and more partial than Bentham hoped. Education reform showed his ideas in action. He wanted universal schooling, secular and practical, teaching skills people actually needed rather than classical languages nobody used. Schools should maximize students' future happiness by giving them useful knowledge. Religious instruction had no place in state education. These proposals scandalized traditionalists but influenced later reformers who gradually built the public education system Bentham envisioned. His involvement with University College London is often overstated. He supported the idea of a secular university open to all, but his direct role in founding it was minimal. Still, the institution embodied his principles. No religious tests for admission, practical subjects alongside traditional ones, education as a tool for social improvement rather than class reproduction. UCL became known as the godless institution on Gower Street, precisely what Bentham would have wanted. The auto-icon remains the strangest part of his legacy. Starting in 1769, when he was just 21, Bentham included provisions in his will for his body's dissection and preservation. He refined these instructions over decades, finally leaving detailed directions to his friend Thomas Southwood Smith. The body should be dissected publicly for medical education. The skeleton should be preserved, padded with hay, dressed in his clothes, and displayed. The head should be mummified and placed on top. Why pure utilitarianism? Dead bodies serve no purpose rotting in the ground. Medical students need cadavers. Dissection advances knowledge. The preserved body, the auto-icon, could replace expensive portraits and monuments. Identity is preferable to similitude, he wrote. Why paint someone's likeness when you can display the actual person? The logic is impeccable and deeply weird. The dissection happened on June 8, 1832, 2 days after Bentham's death. Southwood Smith delivered a long oration to invited guests, explaining the deceased's philosophy while his body lay on the table. Then the actual dissection performed before an audience. The skeleton was prepared, padded, dressed in Bentham's clothes, including his favourite straw hat. The head was mummified, but something went wrong in the process. It ended up looking grotesque, shrunken and discoloured. A wax head replaced it for display purposes. The auto-icon sat in University College London for decades, wheeled out for special occasions. Stories circulated that it attended board meetings, was counted as present, but not voting. These tales are probably apocryphal, but they capture something true about Bentham's afterlife. Even dead, he remained a presence, a reminder of the Utilitarian project's ambitions and absurdities. The actual head, the mummified one, was kept in storage, sometimes displayed in a box between the auto-icon's feet. Student pranks targeted it over the years. It was stolen, held for ransom, mistreated in various ways. Eventually, UCL removed it from public view for preservation. The auto-icon still sits in the student centre, visible to anyone who visits. Bentham's actual body, or most of it, on permanent display. Utilitarianism taken to its logical conclusion. His writing style presents challenges to modern readers. Dense, repetitive, filled with invented terminology and elaborate classification schemes. He created words when existing ones didn't capture his precise meaning. Maximize codification, international. These Benthamisms entered common usage. Others, like postprandial vibrations for after-dinner walks, mercifully died with him. The neologisms reflected his conviction that precise language enabled clear thinking. If you can't name it properly, you can't think about it correctly. The manuscripts are overwhelming in their volume and incompleteness. 6 million words, maybe more, scattered across tens of thousands of pages. Some texts exist in multiple versions with contradictory content. Some break off mid-sentence, abandoned when Bentham moved to a new project. The editorial task of making sense of this chaos has occupied scholars for generations. The University College London Bentham project, begun in the 1950s, has been slowly producing authoritative editions of his works. Dozens of volumes published so far, more in preparation. Each requires painstaking work, comparing manuscripts, deciphering handwriting, determining chronology, deciding which version represents Bentham's final intention. The project will continue for decades. We still don't have complete access to everything he wrote. What emerges from this editorial work is a more complex Bentham than the simplified versions found in textbooks. He wasn't just the pleasure-pain calculator, the man who reduced morality to arithmetic. He wrestled with profound questions about law, politics, psychology, economics, religion. He changed his positions, refined arguments, explored contradictions. The published works show a systematic thinker. The manuscripts reveal someone more exploratory, willing to pursue ideas wherever they led. His influence on legal theory extends beyond utilitarianism proper. The analytical approach to law, treating it as a human construct subject to rational analysis rather than natural law or divine command, owes much to Bentham. H.L.A. Hart, the 20th century's most influential legal philosopher, explicitly built on Benthamite foundations. The idea that law's validity comes from social facts rather than moral content, legal positivism, traces back to Bentham's critique of Blackstone. Economic theory absorbed his ideas selectively. The defense of usury influenced debates about interest rate regulation. His work on taxation shaped utilitarian approaches to public finance. But economists largely ignored his broader critiques of laissez-faire, his arguments for government intervention in certain markets. They took what fit their preconceptions, left the rest. Political economy, as he understood it, was inseparable from ethics and law. You couldn't discuss market efficiency without addressing distribution of wealth, couldn't analyse property rights without considering their effects on happiness. Modern economics split these domains, treating efficiency as a technical question separate from equity or justice. Bentham would have found this division incoherent. The whole point was integrating different aspects of social life into a unified, utilitarian framework. Prison reform shows both the power and limitations of his approach. The focus on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment influenced modern penology. The emphasis on humane treatment, productive labour, education for inmates, all reflected utilitarian principles. Suffering should be minimised even for criminals. Prisons should reduce future crime, not just exact revenge. These ideas gradually transformed penal practice, but the Panopticon's emphasis on constant surveillance, on power through visibility, has darker implications. Michel Foucault famously analysed it as a metaphor for modern disciplinary society. The shift from physical punishment to mental control, from torturing bodies to managing souls, Bentham's prison design crystallised this transformation. Whether Foucault was fair to Bentham is debatable. The Panopticon was meant to improve prisoners' treatment, not maximise their oppression. Still, the critique reveals something troubling about utilitarian logic. Efficiency in controlling behaviour can serve liberty or tyranny, depending on who wields it. The relationship with James Mill shaped Bentham's later years profoundly. Mill became his most devoted follower, organising his manuscripts, promoting his ideas, bringing his young son John Stuart to learn at the master's feet. The Mills lived in a house Bentham owned. They spent summers at his country estate, Ford Abbey. The relationship was intellectually intense and emotionally complex. Bentham was difficult, demanding, obsessive, prone to melancholy. He suffered bouts of what he called psychosomatic blindness, episodes where stress or overwork left him temporarily unable to see. Friends nursed him through these crises. Mill provided practical support and intellectual companionship, but also challenged him, pushed back against ideas he found extreme or impractical. The younger Mill, John Stuart, absorbed Benthamism in childhood, underwent a mental breakdown in young adulthood, partly from the weight of these expectations, and spent his life both extending and revising his godfather's philosophy. His autobiography describes Bentham as brilliant but limited, lacking poetic sensibility, unable to appreciate the non-utilitarian dimensions of human life. This critique cut deep precisely because it came from within the utilitarian tradition. What did Bentham think of his own legacy? He knew most of his work remained unpublished, that his systematic code of law would never be completed. He knew the Panopticon had failed. He knew many of his proposals were ignored or rejected. Yet he kept writing, kept refining, kept believing that eventually the force of rational argument would prevail. Truth would triumph over prejudice. Utility would replace tradition as the guide to legislation. This faith seems naive now. Rational argument rarely triumphs over entrenched interests. Social change comes from political struggle, not philosophical demonstration. Bentham understood this intellectually, developed his theory of sinister interests to explain why the powerful resist reform. But emotionally, he couldn't fully accept it. He thought, if you could just show people the calculations, prove that reform would increase happiness, they'd have to agree. They didn't. The final decade saw no slowing of output. He wrote until a month before his death at age 84, producing manuscripts on constitutional law, judicial procedure, political economy, logic. The body was failing, but the mind kept working, analysing, proposing, calculating. On June 6, 1832, in his house on Queen Square Place, Jeremy Bentham died. Thomas Southwood Smith followed his instructions precisely: the dissection, the preservation, the auto-icon. Utilitarianism carried to its logical end. The auto-icon sits there still, in University College London's Student Centre. Students walk past every day, barely glancing at the peculiar cabinet containing a skeleton dressed in 18th century clothes, topped with a wax head. Most don't know who he was. Those who do often find it morbid, a Victorian oddity that somehow survived into the modern era. But there's something fitting about it. Bentham spent his life trying to make himself useful, to convert every aspect of existence into measurable benefit. Why should death be different? The body, once deceased, could serve science through dissection. The remains could educate through display. Even the horror of mortality could be diminished if corpses became familiar objects rather than hidden sources of dread. Everything calculated, everything optimized, even decomposition. His instructions were characteristically detailed. Thomas Southwood Smith received them in writing, attached to Bentham's final will, dated May 30th, 1832, just days before his death. Dissect the body publicly. Preserve the skeleton. Reconstruct it with padding. Dress it in my clothes. Create a wax head when the mummification process inevitably fails to preserve the features adequately. Place everything in a wooden cabinet with glass panels. Make me an auto-icon. Southwood Smith followed through. On June 9th, 1832, 3 days after Bentham's death, he delivered a lengthy oration over the corpse to a select audience at the Webb Street School of Anatomy. The printed version includes an engraving showing Bentham's body partially covered by a sheet, a macabre memento of the event. Then came the dissection, the reconstruction, the preservation. The mummification of the head did fail rather spectacularly. The process left it desiccated and discoloured, the features distorted beyond recognition. So a wax replacement was created, and the actual head was stored separately. For years it sat at the auto-icon's feet inside the cabinet. Later it was removed to storage after students kept stealing it, as a prank. The preserved head occasionally appears in photographs, looking disturbingly unlike the wax version above, a reminder that Bentham's utilitarian efficiency couldn't quite overcome the messiness of biological reality. What did Bentham think this would accomplish? He wrote about it in a pamphlet begun the year before his death, arguing that auto-icons could serve multiple purposes. They'd reduce the need for expensive monuments and portraits. They'd make medical education easier by normalizing dissection. They'd improve public health by removing decaying corpses from churchyards. They'd diminish death's terror by making it ordinary, even useful. The logic is perfectly Benthamite. Take something society treats with irrational reverence or fear, strip away the mystification, calculate its actual utility, optimize accordingly. Death isn't sacred. It's a biological event that can be managed for maximum benefit. The body isn't holy. It's organic material that can serve pedagogical or commemorative functions more efficiently than stone monuments. Yet there's something unsettling about the auto-icon that goes beyond simple macabre curiosity. It's the ultimate expression of utilitarian thinking, applied without limit. The self becomes an object, measured and optimized, useful even in death. There's no space for dignity that can't be quantified, no recognition of values that resist calculation. Critics pounced on this immediately. Carlyle found it grotesque, a perfect symbol of everything wrong with Bentham's philosophy. Reducing human beings to pleasure-calculating machines while alive was bad enough. Turning them into literal objects after death was the logical endpoint of a system that recognized nothing beyond utility. Where was the human soul in this? Where was the transcendent meaning that separated persons from things? Bentham would have rejected the question entirely. Souls were metaphysical nonsense, meaning was what you could measure in happiness and pain, and persons were distinguished from things precisely by their capacity for pleasure and suffering, not by some mystical essence. The auto-icon was his final demonstration, proof that he'd lived by his principles to the very end. His influence was just beginning to crest when he died. The philosophical radicals, that group of disciples and followers he'd gathered around him, were gaining political power. The Reform Act of 1832 passed just months after his death, expanding the franchise and reforming Parliament in ways Bentham had long advocated. His friend George Grote entered Parliament that same year, bringing Benthamite principles directly into legislative debate. Lord Henry Brougham, another disciple, became Lord Chancellor and pushed through legal reforms that owed clear debts to Bentham's analysis. The secret ballot, educational reforms, the restructuring of poor laws, these bore Bentham's fingerprints, even when his name went unmentioned. By 1843, historian John Hill Burton could identify 26 specific legal reforms traceable to Bentham's arguments. The Westminster Review, co-founded with James Mill in 1823, gave the philosophical radicals a platform for spreading utilitarian ideas. It attacked both Tory traditionalism and Whig complacency, pushing for systematic reform based on rational calculation of consequences. The journal's influence extended beyond Britain, shaping liberal reform movements across Europe and America. But influence flowed in complex ways. Bentham's ideas were adopted, adapted, distorted, sometimes beyond recognition. Reformers invoked utility while ignoring his careful analysis. Politicians used his language while pursuing policies he would have opposed. The principle of greatest happiness became a slogan divorced from the rigorous philosophical foundation he'd tried to build. John Stuart Mill, who'd absorbed Benthamism from childhood, spent much of his career trying to fix what he saw as his godfather's mistakes. Bentham had reduced all pleasures to quantitative differences, treating poetry and pushpin as equivalent if they produced equal pleasure. Mill insisted some pleasures were qualitatively superior, that Socrates dissatisfied was better than a fool satisfied. This directly contradicted Bentham's insistence that pleasure was the only thing valuable in itself. Mill also tried to reconcile utilitarianism with individual liberty in ways Bentham hadn't fully worked out. The principle of utility might justify oppression if it maximized overall happiness. Mill argued for protected spheres of individual freedom, for rights that couldn't be overridden by utilitarian calculation. Whether this was an extension or a betrayal of Benthamism remains debated. The economic applications proved particularly influential and particularly controversial. Bentham's analysis suggested that diminishing marginal utility meant redistribution could increase total happiness. Taking from the rich, who valued each additional pound less, and giving to the poor, who valued it more, would maximize overall welfare. This logic would later underpin progressive taxation and welfare state policies. But Bentham himself was cautious about redistribution, worried about effects on incentives and productivity. He wanted to help the poor through institutional reform, through better education and legal protection, not through direct transfers that might reduce economic growth. Later utilitarians, less concerned with these complications, pushed redistribution further than he would have endorsed. His influence on law was profound, but often unacknowledged. The movement toward codification, towards systematic written law codes replacing common law precedent, drew heavily on his arguments. Nations across Latin America, Europe, and Asia adopted codes influenced by Benthamite principles. The idea that law should be clear, accessible, and rationally organized rather than buried in centuries of judicial decisions, this became common sense partly because Bentham had argued for it so persistently. His contributions to international law are less remembered but equally significant. He coined the term international itself, replacing the older law of nations. He proposed an international court of arbitration to resolve disputes peacefully, a precursor to modern international tribunals. His plan for universal and perpetual peace anticipated later efforts at international organization, though he was more realistic than earlier peace theorists about the obstacles. Animal welfare became another area where his influence grew posthumously. The passage in Principles of Morals and Legislation, arguing that animals' capacity for suffering gave them moral status, regardless of their inability to reason or speak, became foundational for the animal rights movement. The question is not, can they reason? Nor, can they talk, but can they suffer? This single sentence, almost a throwaway in context, would echo through centuries of debate about human obligations to animals. His writings on sexuality remained hidden far longer. The essay on homosexuality, written around 1785, argued that consensual sexual acts between adults harmed no one and therefore shouldn't be criminalized. This was radical beyond what Victorian Britain could contemplate. The manuscript stayed unpublished until 1978, nearly 2 centuries after it was written. Even the portions published in 1931 were heavily edited. What would Bentham have thought about this suppression? He'd have been unsurprised. He understood that entrenched prejudices resisted rational argument, that sinister interests protected themselves through censorship and persecution. He'd written the essay knowing it couldn't be published in his lifetime. But he'd written it anyway, trusting that eventually utility would triumph over superstition. His advocacy for women's equality was similarly ahead of its time. Complete suffrage, equal education, the right to divorce, the right to hold political office, he supported all of it when few others did. Not because of abstract rights, he rejected that language, but because excluding half the population from full participation reduced overall utility. Women's happiness counted equally in the felicific calculus. Their subordination served only the sinister interests of men who benefited from unjust power. These positions cost him influence during his lifetime. Respectable opinion couldn't accept such radicalism, but they established him as a precursor to later movements for equality and liberation. Modern advocates for various causes often cite Bentham as an early supporter, sometimes accurately, sometimes projecting backwards views he never quite held. The university connection is often overstated. Bentham is called the spiritual founder of University College London, which opened in 1826 as the first English institution to admit students regardless of religion, class or gender. He supported the idea, contributed to discussions, and certainly his advocacy for accessible education influenced the founders. But he wasn't directly involved in establishing it, and his auto-icon's presence there is more symbolic than historical. Still, the symbolism matters. UCL represented Benthamite principles in practice, education based on merit rather than privilege, open to all who could benefit, organized rationally rather than according to tradition. That his preserved body sits there, overlooking students from backgrounds he fought to include, creates a connection between his philosophy and its institutional embodiment. The massive corpus of unpublished work presented immediate problems. Bentham had written obsessively for decades, producing millions of words on every conceivable topic. Most remained in manuscript, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, frequently illegible. His handwriting deteriorated over time. His organisational system existed primarily in his own mind, and he'd revised endlessly without clear final versions. Sorting through this material became a multi-generational project. John Bowring published 11 volumes of collected works between 1838 and 1843, but these were selective and sometimes poorly edited. Later scholars discovered that Bowring had often spliced together different manuscripts, created composite texts that Bentham never wrote, and imposed organisation Bentham hadn't intended. The definitive edition, begun in 1968, aimed to publish everything, properly edited from original manuscripts. It's still ongoing, with over 30 volumes published and more in preparation. This reveals both the extent of Bentham's productivity and the difficulty of making sense of it. He'd started projects and abandoned them, written multiple drafts exploring different approaches, generated thousands of pages that he never intended for publication. What emerges from this mass of material? A mind that couldn't stop analysing, that approached every question with the same relentless logic, that believed every problem had a rational solution if you calculated carefully enough. Also visible are the limitations, the blind spots, the moments where the method failed to capture something important. Bentham's legacy is impossible to summarise cleanly because it pulls in opposite directions simultaneously. He's simultaneously the architect of modern welfare states and the inspiration for totalitarian surveillance. The philosopher who insisted on measuring happiness invented a prison design that became synonymous with oppression. The advocate for individual liberty created a political philosophy that some critics say reduces humans to pleasure-seeking machines. These aren't contradictions we can explain away. They're built into the structure of utilitarian thought itself. The modern world is saturated with Benthamite logic, whether we recognise it or not. Cost-benefit analysis, the foundation of policymaking in democratic governments, is pure utility calculation. When economists talk about maximising social welfare, they're speaking Bentham's language. When governments justify taxation by pointing to public goods it funds, they're making utilitarian arguments. The entire apparatus of the welfare state, pensions and unemployment insurance and public health care rests on the premise that collective action can increase net happiness. But we've also learned to be suspicious of this logic. The 20th century showed what happens when governments decide they can calculate the greater good and sacrifice individuals to achieve it. Utilitarianism gave us the NHS. It also gave intellectual cover to eugenics programs. The same reasoning that justifies redistributive taxation could theoretically justify organ harvesting from healthy people to save multiple dying patients. Follow the logic far enough, and you end up places Bentham himself would have rejected. This is the permanent tension in his legacy. The framework is powerful, genuinely useful for thinking through policy questions, but it's also incomplete, missing something crucial about human dignity, about rights as constraints rather than calculations. Modern political philosophy largely consists of people trying to fix utilitarianism, adding qualifications and restrictions to prevent the theory from justifying atrocities in pursuit of aggregate happiness. John Stuart Mill, Bentham's godson and intellectual heir, spent his career trying to make utilitarianism more sophisticated. He distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, arguing that intellectual and moral satisfactions outweighed mere physical pleasure. This saved utilitarianism from the charge that it reduced humans to pigs seeking gratification. But it also violated Bentham's fundamental premise that pleasure is pleasure, measurable on a single scale. Mill's modifications made the theory more palatable but less coherent. The Panopticon's Afterlife demonstrates how ideas escape their origins. Bentham designed it as a humane reform, a way to rehabilitate criminals through work and observation rather than torture and degradation. Michel Foucault appropriated it as the central metaphor for modern disciplinary power, the way contemporary society controls people through surveillance and self-policing rather than overt force. Bentham became, in Foucault's reading, the architect of the surveillance state, the philosopher whose ideas enabled subtle forms of domination. This interpretation would have baffled Bentham. He saw the Panopticon as liberation, making power visible and accountable rather than hidden and arbitrary. The inspector could be watched as easily as the prisoners. The system was transparent, governed by rules designed to reduce suffering. But Foucault identified something Bentham missed: the psychological effect of constant potential observation, the way it makes people police themselves, internalizing the watcher's gaze. We live in a panopticon now, though not the one Bentham designed. Digital surveillance creates exactly the condition he envisioned. Behavior modified by the possibility of observation, compliance achieved through visibility rather than force. Cameras everywhere, data collection constant, algorithms tracking patterns. This is the world Bentham's logic built, even if the specific technologies would have astonished him. Whether this is progress or dystopia depends on who's watching and what they do with the information. The animal welfare arguments anticipated contemporary debates by 2 centuries. Bentham's question, can they suffer, remains the foundation of animal rights philosophy. Peter Singer's influential work draws directly on Bentham, arguing that speciesism is morally equivalent to racism, that we should weigh animal suffering in our ethical calculations. This isn't sentimentality, it's the logical extension of utilitarian principles. If suffering matters, then all suffering matters, regardless of the species experiencing it. But here again, the framework creates problems it can't fully resolve. How do we compare different types of suffering? Is a human's mild discomfort equivalent to an animal's intense pain? Should we weigh the pleasure humans derive from eating meat against the suffering of animals raised for slaughter? Bentham's calculus gives us a way to frame these questions, but no clear method for answering them. The math breaks down when we try to plug in actual values. His influence on economics was profound and sometimes pernicious. The idea that we can reduce complex social phenomena to numerical calculations, that human behavior follows predictable patterns based on pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, this became foundational to classical and neoclassical economics. Homoeconomicus, the rational actor maximizing utility, is Bentham's creation. So is the assumption that markets efficiently allocate resources by aggregating individual preferences. But humans aren't rational utility maximizers. Behavioral economics has spent decades documenting the ways we deviate from this model, the cognitive biases and emotional factors that shape decision-making. We're loss-averse, present-biased, influenced by framing effects. We make systematic errors in predicting what will make us happy. The Benthamite model of human nature is useful as a first approximation, but dangerously incomplete when taken as literal truth. Legal theory still grapples with his arguments. The critique of natural rights as nonsense on stilts poses genuine challenges. If rights aren't natural or God-given, what are they? Where do they come from? How do we justify protecting individual liberty against majority preference? Modern rights theory largely consists of attempts to ground rights in something other than nature or divinity, while avoiding Bentham's conclusion that they're merely useful fictions. Some philosophers have tried to derive rights from contractarian arguments, imagining what rational people would agree to behind a veil of ignorance. Others ground them in human dignity or capabilities. But these alternatives face their own problems, and Bentham's critique retains its force. Rights talk often is just assertion, dressed up as argument, claiming authority without providing justification. We believe in rights because we find the alternative unacceptable, not because we can prove they exist. The auto-icon continues to provoke fascination and discomfort. There's something both admirable and disturbing about the gesture. The insistence on rationality even in death, the refusal of sentiment. Bentham wanted his body to serve utilitarian purposes, advancing medical knowledge and reducing superstitious fear of death. The display would demonstrate that corpses are just matter, that the person is gone, and what remains can be used productively. But the effect is more complicated. Visitors to UCL encounter this preserved figure, dressed in period clothing, staring blankly from behind glass. It's macabre and comic simultaneously, a philosophical statement that becomes a tourist attraction. The university occasionally wheels him out for special occasions, a tradition that seems to mock the seriousness of his intent. Whether this serves utility is questionable. Whether Bentham would have approved is unknowable. His writing style, dense and technical, limited his popular influence during his lifetime. The ideas reached wider audiences through intermediaries like Dumont and later Mill, who translated his technical apparatus into more accessible prose. This created a strange situation where Bentham's philosophy was widely known, but his actual words rarely read. The utilitarian tradition he founded developed partly in conversation with his work and partly independent of it. Reading Bentham now requires patience. The sentences are long, the qualifications endless, the organisation sometimes chaotic. He wasn't a stylist, he was an analyst, breaking down concepts with surgical precision, creating taxonomies and classifications that could feel pedantic. But within the technical language are genuinely original insights, moments where he sees through conventional wisdom to expose the arbitrary foundations beneath. The democratic theory he developed late in life went further than most of his contemporaries could accept. Universal suffrage, annual parliaments, secret ballots, these were radical demands in the early 19th century. He wanted power distributed widely because concentrated power served sinister interests. The aristocracy and monarchy maintained their position through institutions designed to benefit them at the expense of the majority. Reform meant dismantling these structures and replacing them with systems accountable to everyone. But he never romanticized democracy. It was a mechanism, not an ideal. The point wasn't that the people's will was sacred, but that broad participation made it more likely that policy would serve general utility rather than special interests. Democratic institutions could be evaluated by their consequences, not their symbolic value. If aristocracy produced better outcomes, which Bentham doubted but considered an empirical question, it would be preferable. This instrumental view of political institutions puts him at odds with both conservatives, who defended tradition, and radicals, who believed in popular sovereignty as an end in itself. Bentham cared about what worked, what maximised happiness. Forms of government were tools to be assessed by their results. This made him simultaneously more radical and more conservative than his allies expected. The incomplete Panopticon, the comprehensive legal code he never finished, represents both his ambition and its limits. He believed law could be rationalised, made consistent and accessible, stripped of historical accidents and judicial interpretation. Create clear rules derived from the principle of utility, and society would function smoothly, conflicts would be resolved fairly, happiness would increase. The project consumed decades and remained unfinished because the task was impossible. Law can't be reduced to a code, however comprehensive. New situations arise that framers didn't anticipate. Values conflict in ways calculation can't resolve. The human element, judgment, and discretion can't be eliminated. Bentham's failure to complete the Panopticon wasn't personal inadequacy. It was the impossibility of the goal itself, the recognition that social life exceeds any system designed to organize it. Yet the attempt mattered. The process of trying to codify law, to make it rational and accessible, drove genuine reforms. The idea that law should be intelligible to those it governs, that legal reasoning should be transparent rather than mystified, these Benthamite principles improved legal systems, even if the comprehensive code remained elusive. Sometimes the value is in the striving rather than the achievement. His final years were productive, despite declining health. He continued writing until weeks before his death at 84, still trying to perfect his system, still responding to critics, still generating new applications of utilitarian principles. The intensity never flagged.